We are in Kaplankaya on the southwestern coast of Turkey for our annual gathering Harvest series. Here we bring together some of the greatest minds with expert speakers, renowned practitioners and talented performers, all aimed at creating curiosity, opening our minds and imagining a better future. I hope you'll enjoy this interview. Hello, my guest today is Sandy Hill, a sportswoman and intrepid traveler who has visited more than 135 countries, climbed the 7 summits, and reached the top of Mount Everest within 3 attempts. In addition to her physical accomplishments, Sandy's writing skills have earned her a place in esteemed publications, including Vogue, Allure, and Men's Journal. And she's also the author of 2 books. Today, we'll discuss Sandy's relationship to death, her work, her career. Sandy, I was very moved by your speech.
Thank you.
The speech you're doing at Harvest, telling your story of what happened to you just 27 years ago on Mount Everest, when the people you climbed with were hit by a deadly storm and you almost died. You also shared a moment that you called a social death, and this is the first time you're talking about it. Just to be clear, you're not doing this to be in the spotlight again, because you and your family have suffered quite enough from it. But you're here to share what you went through, how you went through this, and how you found peace. I think showing your vulnerability will help a lot of people, and thank you for that, Sandy.
Thank you for having me.
So can we go back straight to this day on Everest, on that day, a day that changed everyone's life there. How were you prepared for it, and what were the conditions like?
Well, I think anybody that climbs Mount Everest has to be prepared for the very high likelihood that the afternoon storm is going to roll in at 5, 6 o'clock around sunset. For the 2 months before you summit the mountain, you're sitting at base camp and you look up to the summit, hoping that maybe one day you're going to stand up there, but you see the storm. You don't have to really be very astute to see every day, like clockwork, a storm comes in. The severity of the storm is what marked the night that we spent out. I don't know if it was the most severe storm. Other climbing expeditions have also been forced to ground and spend the night and have a bivouac. And fortunately for my team and I, we all survived the night that we spent out. So the storm, well, let me say that when the sun rose while we were all on ascent, into a clear sky, and it was just a bluebird day. And even until very close to the summit, it was quite clear. And but the last hour, we could feel a wind coming up. But of course, we weren't really looking down the hill, we were looking up the hill. But when we were on the summit and turned around and looked down, you could see that what the storm was doing was welling up from below. So as clear as it was looking up, it was what was below us that was going to present the danger. So we didn't spend very long on the summit. It was 15 minutes, and I think we have one team photograph, and it's like a haphazard clump of humans, and that was it. And we all started our descent. The descent usually takes 4.5 hours. That's a normal pace to travel 2 kilometers down the hill. But 3 hours into the descent, it was very quick. The wind picked up. Well, first, it was total whiteout. By total whiteout, I mean, it was like swimming in a glass of milk whiteout. You could maybe see from me to you, but not much farther than that. It was really a total whiteout. And then as the sun set, so this was around 6 o'clock at night now, as the sun set, the wind picked up to 100 kilometers an hour eventually, making it practically impossible to walk. Before the whiteout, we actually had the tents in sight. It was the tents that were our destination for that night. The tents where there was water, there was food, there were warm sleeping bags, and there was more oxygen. So we had stashed them there at midnight the night before. So now we're working on, close to 18 hours, let's say, without any resupply of food or fuel or anything. And our oxygen was depleting, if not already depleted. So, because you only take so much oxygen as you need. So we were together as a group. We were walking together as a group, and we lost sight of the tents, because I couldn't see. No one could see any farther. Wow. We thought we had the right direction, and we walked in that direction, and we didn't bump into the tents. So we did what's logical, which is to walk in concentric circles. Whether we were actually walking in a perfect contemplative concentric circle line, one will never know. We stumbled around arm in arm in this 100 kilometer an hour wind, but knowing full well that it was possible to fall off the edge. The area that our tents were on is called the South Col, and it's actually an area between Mount Everest and Lhotse, its companion mountain. And there's a little sort of the crotch between those two peaks is where we had our tents pitched. It's the area of like a couple of football fields max. Okay. And having climbed up the other direction with a 10,000 foot drop down only 2 years before, I knew how steep that was. You're falling 10,000 feet into Tibet, and it really does fall off, like walking off of a skyscraper. So we all were aware of this. So it didn't make sense to just keep walking and walking and walking. We weren't finding the tents, and anyway, walking became increasingly difficult. We decided to huddle for the night, to just lay in a dog pile, and through squirming around and like taking care of each other, we would get ourselves through the night. So we did that until we hoped that there would be a break in the storm. And there actually was. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, there was a break in the storm, and a few of our members were able to run to the tents, which I would later learn was only 50 meters away.
Okay, ironic, yeah.
But I was not with that group. I was with 2 other members of our group, but those people were able to direct somebody
to help you,
to help us. So Anatoly Bukriv, who is now passed, he died in a climbing accident on Annapurna a couple of years later, but just an incredible, like one of the great climbers of all time and my lifetime hero, came out into the night to find us, and he did, and he brought us back to the safety of the tents. It's amazing, like as soon as you get a little warm beverage and some warm sleeping bag and a little oxygen, how quickly you're restored. So for me and my team, we all survived the night, but it did become the deadliest night on Mount Everest. 8 people lost their lives in the storm, including people that were very close to nearby us in the huddle. They weren't on our team, but one woman was just 2.5 meters away from us, and she'd been abandoned by her teammates, and she perished alone. Another man did walk off the edge, so our fears were not unwarranted. And actually, the leader of our expedition, who was not climbing with us that day, but he was technically the leader of the expedition, he was doing something he was taking pictures on his own. He also lost his life. He was stranded above the storm and couldn't make it down. So it was I never know how to define these things, near-death experience. I mean, I've always thought, like, either you died or you didn't die, maybe just driving your car these days is a near-death experience.
Yeah.
One never knows, but that is actually a valid way I've come to understand that life is a near-death experience. And so over the 27 years it's been since then, it's given me a lot of time and to contemplate the thin line between life and death, and to embrace the possibility of death. And as a result of it, my life has become much richer.
During that those frozen moments when you didn't know, you couldn't see, you didn't know where to go, were you always conscious, or were there moments where you lost consciousness?
Actually, I wasn't always conscious. No. Something that, well, I would later learn the technicality of what happened to me. But people do always ask me, what's it like to believe that you're about to die? Mm-hmm. But I didn't think that I was about to die, because some crazy cocktail combination of my hormones kicked in that caused me to hallucinate. And I actually hallucinated that, well, this is while we were in the dog pile, I hallucinated that we were not in the middle of a blinding, debilitating snowstorm, but I was actually sitting outside of a Tibetan tea house. And there are no Tibetan tea houses at 8,000 meters, just for the record. But I could see it very clearly. It was just like over there, and I was sitting on the grass in front of the tea house. It was a little chilly outside, but it wasn't too cold. And there were lots of people inside, and they were serving tea, and there was a warm fire inside. And I thought, I'd like some tea too. That would kind of warm me up, but I didn't feel like I was freezing to death, which I might well have been. But I just felt, you felt that way, like a little cold, and you'd like a little cup of tea to hold in front of you. So I was trying to get the attention of the waiter. And who knows how much time I spent doing this, but waving my hand, that feeling when you can't get the attention of the waiter and he's right there. Well, I mean, it's a little frustrating, but you think like, it must be me. I don't know, whatever, but he'll eventually notice me. And so I was like, waiter over here. And I'll never know if that was me calling the waiter was what actually enabled Anatoly to find us. It's occurred to me. And he and I remained friends after the expedition. And I don't know if I really ever asked him the question if it was me calling for the waiter. But the amazing thing is he did bring a thermos of hot chocolate.
Wow.
Anyway, so that, so I hallucinated. So the lesson that taught me, and believe me, this was not like a thunderbolt lightning strike of a lesson. It's, I've had 27 years to ruminate over this. But the lesson that it taught me was a lot about control. So I would have called myself in my 30s and 40s a control freak, okay? Which used to be a compliment, because like everyone thought that unless you were a control freak, you couldn't get things done. And I was a master of getting things done. And I had my little checklist every day, and I would always have everything checked off. And I was just sure that my life was unfolding in the amazing, positive, wonderful way that it has, because I was in control. If I hadn't hallucinated, if the hand of the divine hadn't intervened and flooded my brain with the dopamine and that it did to cause me to hallucinate, I might well have been the one that was saying, okay, guys, let's do this, let's do that, making a plan. But unwittingly, I accepted this situation, which, like sitting in front of a tea house and not able to get the attention of the waiter, isn't that bad.
Okay, wow.
Right? So I wasn't hyperventilating. I wasn't crying and saying, I don't want to die, and, or organizing.
In this way,
yeah. And it's a preservation of energy. There was really nothing you could do about it, like nothing. Yeah. You couldn't walk. We all had all the gear that we had. We were taking care of one another. We shared the little resources we had. It was really at that point just a toss of the roulette table, like whatever was going to happen. So unwittingly, I didn't control anything. And afterwards, I do remember thinking, like, gosh, like, how did this happen that we all survived? And I didn't organize anything. Just like it happened this way. And I wondered if that wasn't the reason. And I think there are other reasons too, like the fact that we were an incredible team together, and everyone being in a situation like that is a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole, where like put that one down and then this one comes up and put that one down. So our spirits waxed and waned. So like the circumstances weren't a steady downhill trajectory, like getting worse and worse and worse. Some people felt buoyant while other people didn't. And then the buoyant ones started to tank, and the ones that had been down started to lift. So it was like this. So, and that was a great factor, that we all stayed together.
And do you think the other team, a lot of people didn't make it? Do you think it's because they were not so close as you?
Well, I'll never know. I wasn't on that team. I didn't have anything to do with that team. But it is a fact that I've only read accounts about, but they all broke up for various reasons. And their team suffered terribly in casualties. And so I really can't speak to their experience, but it is true that we survived. And I know that the reason that we survived is because we stayed together.
So you experienced an almost physical death, but you also mentioned a social death. Yes.
So there was a writer that was on the mountain that night. And he was on the other expedition, and I didn't know him really at all. I knew of his reputation. I admired his writing, actually. When we came down from the South Col, we were met by a storm of a whole different sort. There were reporters that had flown in from Kathmandu by helicopter, swarming all over base camp. So it was quickly the story of the minute. Later, every newspaper in the world would carry a story about it. The New York Times was above the fold. It had a couple of, that's when newspapers used to be published actually on paper, and it folded. And so it was a sensational story. And the writer that was on the other team was called to write a sensational story about it, in which he, like everyone who wasn't there, felt a need to answer the question, who is to blame for this? Now, climbers know that one of the reasons that we go to these big places is because you're in awe of the mystery of the place, and there's no blame. Nature is what nature is, and it's bigger than us. You're not standing on top of the world, on top of the mountain, thumping your chest and saying, like, I've conquered this mountain. That's what people who don't climb think about climbers. But I think that most climbers who are alive, and many who are not, climb because of how small it makes you feel. And how insignificant, when you're standing on top of Everest, you realize you are just a speck of dust in the cosmos. And it's the most incredible, really an addictive feeling to be that way. So, but people who don't climb, and people who are addicted to sensational stories, like to try to figure it out. It's the armchair athlete. And this writer wrote for that person. and there's a lot of them in the world. And he wrote a best-selling book. And still the question was, who is to blame for this? And he blamed me. And it was a scathing depiction that he made of me. I believe that he was motivated by selling books and, a capitalist impulse, if you will, turning this tragedy into his personal bounty, I guess, which was something I couldn't do. I also am a writer, and I had a book contract and I had magazine contracts and other obligations after that, but I felt like I couldn't write about it. I couldn't speak about it. First of all, I was deeply grieved, and I was in such awe of what had happened that no words came to me, but it also seemed like capitalizing like blood money. So that was antithetical to me. That's not how I don't roll that way. My stories are mostly, I hope, uplifting, even when there's not a summit involved. There's a lesson to be learned that is uplifting at the end of everything. So writing about the tragedy and capitalizing on the sensationalism wasn't for me. He blamed me, and he painted a portrait of me that was not true, not accurate. He is still a very skilled writer, but he said absurd things, like implied that I had brought a hairdresser to base camp and that I had a cappuccino maker at base camp. And in subsequent movie depictions of the tragedy, there's an actress portraying me, and she's rudely directing her Sherpa to hump up this like 5-seater, cappuccino machine like you see in an Italian coffee bar.
Which was far from truth?
Well, in fact, I did bring a coffee pot, and it was the kind that you probably use, or almost anybody uses on a camping trip, which is those little aluminum mocha machines, that percolate from the bottom up. And they make stronger coffee than, you can make it over a fire. And it's like that.
Not the only one to do that.
And so he must have derived this, back in the 90s, fancy coffee was like a new thing. Starbucks was relatively new.
Okay.
So fancy coffee, if you call Starbucks fancy coffee, but that was the fanciest coffee. Coffee's always a thing with climbers. Like there's a couple of, one of my best climbing friends, his nickname is Java because he's got to have coffee before he's going anywhere. It doesn't matter what time of day or night he has to get out. He has his coffee. So anyway, me being me, tried to elevate our coffee experience. So this is my recipe for cappuccino at base camp. You take a mason jar, your lidded coffee thermos or anything, and you put the coffee in, and then you take powdered milk from India, because the Indian powdered milk is a high fat powdered milk. So it tastes actually like milk. It's got like a mouthfeel. And after you've combined the two, then you shake it really hard. And so it's got foam, and then you pour it into another cup, and you say in a very elevated tone to somebody, "Good morning, would you like your cappuccino?"
Okay.
So it looks like that.
Okay.
That's my recipe for cappuccino. And that was my cappuccino machine.
Okay.
It's this.
Okay. Yeah. It's not the...
No.
Okay.
But rather than finding out the truth of it, it made a better, because he didn't interview me, so it made a better story to talk about my cappuccino machine instead of finding out what really happened.
But today you want to be clear that you don't carry the responsibility of the other teams,
no,
like the press said.
No, I don't. He even went so far out on a limb as to suggest that the storm was brought on by the wrath of the mountain gods, who were vengeful over my love life. And so I mean, that just requires so many moving parts to wrap your head around. But so he placed the blame on my shoulders for the storm, for excess at base camp. And there were many other examples. Did I say he implied that I had a hairdresser with me? Yeah. And so, and there were many other things. I don't want to promote the book. And most people have read it. It was a New York Times bestseller forever and ever. But so the social death that I met was, first there was a magazine article that was just scathing. He published for Outside Magazine a couple of months after the expedition, and there were many, many errors in that. Just not just about me. In fact, he claimed to have had a conversation with the person who actually had already died. He was the one who walked off the edge. So the author said that he had a conversation with a person that was known to have been deceased.
Okay.
And this got into publication. So this is one example of many that were factually incorrect. And a lot of those facts were changed, or not facts, a lot of those errors were changed for the publication of the book. But the venom that he spewed for me was not. And there was then and still is to some extent, but now people are much more media savvy, that just because something's published between two covers doesn't mean it's true. Like, we've been fed a lot of misinformation by people who have ulterior motives. And these examples are in front of us every single day. So it was, for me back then, difficult to refute. And anyway, it's very hard to have a conversation when you're in a defensive position from the get-go. You know, it's like, have you stopped beating your wife lately? Like, where do you start with that? You're already in the weak position. So I got smeared socially. My social reputation was immolated. My credibility as a writer, as a climber, as a spokesperson, these were the ways that I was making my living, were ended. And worse than that, it was constant fodder for the press. There were photographers hiding in the bushes outside my apartment. I lived in Manhattan at the time, and every time I would go out, or many times when I would go out, there would be pictures that I would inevitably show up as an example of how careless and unfeeling that I was, that I could go out under the circumstances, and that I should be home under feeling guilt and shame for this. So it was an extremely difficult time. It was the most difficult time in my life. It had a big impact on my son. He was 14 or 15 years old at the time. He suffered terribly in school. He was, the mothers would ask him, how does it feel to have your mother having done this terrible thing, which is a lot to put on a child. So he decided to move out, and when and I got hit with divorce papers from my husband of 17 years also. So it was like the whole world came crashing down. So I was instantly in an empty nest by myself. And I sunk into a very, very deep depression. For 2 years, I lived in my pajamas and watched the Starfield simulation screensaver on my desktop computer. Wow. Which turns out not to be such a bad meditative advice. Wow. Okay. Whoever the creator of that is must have had some meditative experience in mind, but I barely could recognize myself. I went to a Freudian analyst that was recommended by a friend. And after, I don't know how long on the couch, and the analyst came to the conclusion that if I had summited Everest on my first or second attempt, I forgot to mention this was my third attempt, if I'd summited on my first or second attempt, my husband wouldn't have left me, as though that had anything to do with the price of tea in China. But, this was 2 years before Monica Lewinsky and 2 decades before Me Too. So things like that were, possible to say even by a trained analyst. I should say, I've been climbing since I was 9 years old. I grew up as a climber kid, like a dirt bag, which is a term of endearment in the climbing world.
Yeah, you were not like an unprepared socialite.
No,
like deciding to.
No, he portrayed me that way. But in fact, I've been climbing since I was 9 years old. I was part of this little youth group in the Bay Area of San Francisco that was led by a UC Berkeley professor and his girlfriend. And they were carefree hippies. This was in the 60s and the early 70s. And they would load us into their VW van with peace stickers and flowers all over it and stuff, and take their guitars, and we'd like go hiking and then eventually climbing when we got old enough, and doing expeditions. So we did this all over the west coast of the United States. And I was a guide in Yosemite when I was in high school, a mountaineering guide. And I wound up in New York in 1976 because I was going to graduate school at Columbia in the School of Architecture, but I arrived in Manhattan with my backpack and hiking boots and down parkas. So climbing was really something that I'd always done. And then I took an unwitting hiatus from climbing for about 10 years as I pursued my career and marriage and having my son, but went back to it then as an adult. And once I felt that we had the means for me to start taking these trips, which I originally funded on our own, but then I became a sponsored climber. So climbing was not new to me at all. Adventuring was not new to me at all.
What's interesting is when we see you, how does someone, after so much, after having experiencing so much hatred and being in the public eye, how do you come back on your feet after that?
Well, I finally got away from the Starfield simulation, brushed my teeth, and got out of my pajamas when first, wait, I'm lapsing a decade. First, I spent a decade, this was the early 2000s, as the owner of a vineyard. So I drank a lot. And looking back, I did it like as a highbrow way. I had a vineyard and I was drinking really good wine and stuff like that, and deluded myself into thinking that this was elevated. And I elevated myself past these circumstances and pulled myself out of the doldrums. But alcohol is not the solution to anything for me anyway. I don't identify as an alcoholic, but anyway, so I dabbled in alcohol for a decade. And then in 2011 or 12, I discovered CrossFit. So CrossFit, if you are not familiar with it, is an activity that measures your success by quantifiable results. So the complete opposite of mountaineering. It's how many burpees, push-ups, pull-ups, how much weight can you put over your head? It's super quantifiable and it's super objective. And so I was like, great, here's a sport that I can do. I'm predisposed to doing it. A lot of it is endurance. Some of it is skill. So CrossFit pulled me out of it, and I trained hard. And once I found out that there was a competition, I'd never competed before. I don't consider myself a very good competitor because I had never done anything competitive. So CrossFit pulled me out of it initially. But then I in 2013 was introduced for the first time in my life to psychedelics. Ayahuasca was my gateway drug, and this was I just tried ayahuasca to help a friend who was a Marine that was suffering from PTSD and had heard that ayahuasca was helping people, and he needed somebody to hold his hand. So I went to the ayahuasca ceremony with him. And I actually have a kind of funny story about my first ayahuasca experience, because I was just there to, I didn't really think that I had any issues because I had overcome them with CrossFit.
It's the harvest of the day question I'm asking to every guest of this podcast. If there is one thing that gives you hope, what is it?
Well, oh boy, hope's a difficult thing for me. I'm going to be perfectly candid with you, because hope in some iterations is like a fancy dress up for fear. Okay. Like, I hope I make $1 million. Yeah. That's a manifestation of fear. Okay. It sounds optimistic, but it's not really. It's not good. That's a reflection of a shadow, a mask. So when hope is embodied, really embodied, and lived into, where you feel, let's say, it has to do with alignment of values. So if you want $1 million because having that is going to give you freedom, that's a value. Okay. So if you can embody what the value is, freedom. I hope I make $1 million. Great. Hope away.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for being in this podcast of Harvest Series, for being here with us, and for sharing your story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you for watching this episode of Harvest Series. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you want to hear more, you can click on the subscribe button, and I hope to see you soon for our next interview.